nations will have signed energy compacts that detail the regulatory changes, the policy responses, the electrification planning work, and ultimately more than $50 billion in concessional financing commitments that will be required to achieve what those African leaders called Mission 300.
Something huge is happening, and the United States didn't see it coming. While Washington's eyes were fixed on Europe and the Middle East, two unlikely partners quietly started rewriting global power: Africa and India, in the shadows of sanctions, trade wars, and dollar diplomacy. A $50 billion master plan is being drawn up, one that could flip the global economic map upside down. This isn't charity, this isn't aid, it's strategy, pure, calculated, and revolutionary. For decades, the US lectured Africa about development while outsourcing its own industries. But now, Africa isn't waiting for permission, it's signing billion-dollar deals with India. From solar grids in Kenya, to industrial corridors in Ghana, to digital payment systems connecting Lagos to Mumbai, the two regions are building something America never imagined: a South-South economic superpower. Think about it, for the first time in modern history, African and Indian engineers, bankers, and tech leaders are designing their own blueprint for trade, defense, and digital independence, without Washington in the room. And here's the twist: this alliance didn't start with politics. It started with trust. India, once a student of Western capitalism, is now teaching Africa how to build without the IMF's chains, and Africa? It's proving that innovation doesn't need permission from Wall Street. While American pundits argue about who controls global tech, African startups are quietly partnering with Indian AI firms to process millions of data points, building apps, satellites, and even fintech systems that bypass the US dollar entirely. This is more than economics, it's a power shift. A slow, silent, unstoppable wave that could redefine global alliances for the next 50 years. So the real question is, can America stop it? Or has the New World Order already begun, led not from Washington or Brussels, but from Accra, Nairobi, and New Delhi? Because what's unfolding right now isn't just business, it's the biggest geopolitical surprise of the decade. You see, for years, Washington believed it could predict every global move. They had the satellites, the intelligence networks, the analysts, every tool money could buy. But what they didn't see was this: a quiet alliance forming between nations the West once underestimated. While the US tightened sanctions on rivals and cut deals with Europe, Africa and India were building roads, fiber networks, and industrial cities together. No headlines, no photo ops, just progress. The $50 billion plan is more than just trade. It's a declaration of economic independence. Imagine a world where African raw materials no longer sail to Western ports, but to Indian refineries, where the finished products return to African markets, not under foreign brands, but under African ownership. It's happening already. In Tanzania, Indian firms are building one of the continent's largest solar manufacturing plants. In Nigeria, joint AI labs are designing low-cost tech for small businesses, without a single dollar of Western aid. And in Ethiopia, a new industrial corridor backed by Indian investment is employing tens of thousands, feeding a dream once thought impossible: an Africa that manufactures, not just supplies. But here's what's shaking the White House: this alliance threatens to undermine America's last leverage, the dollar. Because as India expands its digital payment systems into Africa, both regions are moving toward transactions in local currencies, cutting out the need for US approval or swift oversight. In short, Africa and India are building their own version of the global economy, and the West doesn't like losing control. You can almost feel the tension rising in global trade rooms. American lobbyists are suddenly showing up in African summits they ignored for years. European investors are scrambling to catch up, offering partnerships that sound suspiciously like apologies. But the message from Africa and India is crystal clear: we're no longer waiting for permission to grow. Behind this $50 billion strategy lies a shared history, one of colonial scars and modern resilience. Both regions understand what it means to be underestimated. Both have learned to turn pressure into power. And now, united by trade, technology, and ambition, they're shaping a future that no longer revolves around Washington. So as America debates its next sanctions, Africa and India are doing something far more powerful, creating their own rules. The question is no longer if the global order is shifting, it's how fast. Because when the next century of economic power is written, it might not be signed in New York or London, but in Addis Ababa and New Delhi. And that is the story the world almost missed.
For decades, America believed Africa would always look west, that every loan, every aid package, every diplomatic handshake would begin and end in Washington. But somewhere along the dusty highways of Addis Ababa, and inside the bustling ports of Mombasa, something quietly changed. Because while America was busy policing the world, another player stepped into the shadows, carrying no lectures, no sanctions, and no conditions. That player was India. Few in Washington noticed the shift at first, just small contracts, quiet summits, harmless trade deals. But what started as routine diplomacy has now become a $50 billion power play that could rewrite Africa's economic future. And America's place in it. This isn't just about money, it's about influence, trust, and revenge for decades of imbalance. And the strangest part, this plan wasn't built in secret war rooms, it was built in plain sight. Here's what America didn't see coming. While Washington debated sanctions and strategic interests, India quietly positioned itself as the new face of global partnership, and Africa welcomed it with open arms. In just 5 years, India has become one of Africa's top 5 trading partners. But this new alliance isn't built on aid, it's built on mutual survival. Africa has resources. India has markets, technology, and political weight. Together, they've crafted a plan that could shift $50 billion worth of trade away from U.S. control and maybe even the dollar itself. The U.S. once stayed as a leash. Now Africa is cutting it loose. It began quietly with a single question whispered in African policy. Circles. What if we don't need Washington anymore? From Nairobi to Abuja, from Dar es Salaam to Accra, that question turned into a strategy. And when India answered with investments instead of interference, something unprecedented happened. Africa started to believe it could build with Asia, not depend on the West. A new energy corridor connecting Mozambique's gas fields to Indian ports. An African-made smartphone brand powered by Indian software. A $5 billion infrastructure fund co-financed by New Delhi and the African Union that doesn't report to the IMF. Each move looked harmless on its own. Together, they form a blueprint that Washington's economists are now calling the stealth realignment. The White House didn't see it coming because America was watching China. Every policy report, every press briefing, every Africa strategy was designed around countering Beijing. But while Washington kept its eyes on China's Belt and Road, India quietly built something smarter, a softer belt. One built not with debt traps but with shared growth, not through military bases but through digital corridors, tech schools, and vaccine diplomacy. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't threatening. It was effective. By 2025, U.S. trade with Africa had plateaued. India's had doubled. And then came the $50 billion plan, the spark that turned quiet cooperation into a geopolitical earthquake. It is called the IAI Framework India-Africa Infrastructure Initiative, an agreement that links 18 African countries under a single investment umbrella led by India's Exim Bank and supported by African development funds. Together, they're financing railways, tech parks, and rare earth mining projects once dominated by American and European firms. To the average citizen, it's just another deal. But to Washington insiders, it's a warning flare. Because if Africa and India can build their own economic system, one that bypasses the US dollar and the World Bank S-strings, then America's decades-old leverage could vanish almost overnight. Imagine African oil sold in rupees. Copper paid for in digital rupee-backed tokens. A BRICS payment gateway replacing SWIFT. It's not fiction anymore, it's happening. And while US policymakers scramble to understand the data, Africa and India are already one step ahead, setting up trade hubs in Kenya, digital fintech bridges in Lagos, and joint defense programs in Namibia. What used to be aid missions are now equal partnerships. What used to be lectures from the West are now handshakes from the East, and the world is watching. So what exactly is this $50 billion plan? Why did America miss it? And could this alliance mark the beginning of the end for Washington's dominance in Africa? Stay with me, because what you're about to see is more than a trade deal. It's a silent revolution, one built not by force but by strategy. And if history is any guide, when empires start ignoring small alliances, those alliances often end up rewriting the map. To understand the rise of the India-Africa partnership, you need to look at what America stopped seeing. For decades, U.S. foreign policy toward Africa revolved around one word: aid. Aid for food, aid for health, aid for democracy. But while America was sending aid, others were sending investments. China built the rails, Turkey built the ports, and India built trust. It started in places most Americans couldn't find on a map: Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, Mozambique. Small agreements that didn't make headlines. An IT training center here, a pharmaceutical plant there, a solar power grid built by Indian engineers deep in rural Zambia. To Washington, these were minor gestures. But to Africa, they were partnerships that worked no lectures, no conditionalities, no reforms demanded by Western institutions. And soon, Africa began to ask a dangerous question. If India can give us technology and trade without telling us how to govern, why can't America? Between 2018 and 2024, India's trade with Africa doubled from $32 billion to nearly $70 billion. Over 6,000 Indian companies now operate across 41 African nations. But what makes this story explosive is not the scale of trade. It's how it's being done. India isn't following America's rulebook. It's writing a new one with the global south at the center. Here's the untold part. This so-called 50 billion plan isn't just a number, it's a web of projects designed to slowly move Africa away from Western dependence. The strategy has 4 layers, and every layer hits at the heart of American power. India is now Africa's fastest growing energy buyer, importing crude from Nigeria, Angola, and Mozambique. And those deals? They're not denominated in US dollars anymore. In 2025, Nigeria became the first African nation to settle oil sales with India, partly in rupees, a quiet yet seismic step in global finance to the US Treasury. That's a red flag. Because every barrel not traded in dollars weakens the very foundation of American dominance, the petrodollar system. Next, the infrastructure. Web. Under the India-Africa Infrastructure Initiative, New Delhi has pledged $50 billion in joint financing co-funded with African nations, not imposed through Western-style loans. The vision. A corridor stretching from Mombasa to Mumbai, integrating African supply chains with Indian manufacturing zones. The US tried something similar with the Build Back Better World initiative, but it stalled. Meanwhile, India's projects are already breaking ground with local workers, not imported contractors. That difference matters. Because when Africans see bulldozers with their flags beside India's, they see equality, not dependency. While the West still debates who controls Africa's data, India is quietly wiring the continent with digital diplomacy. Under its Digital Africa Partnership, India has built over 200 digital learning centers, coding hubs, and fintech collaborations. In Kenya, UPI India's digital payment system is being adapted into Afropay, a cross-border payment bridge. And experts say this could one day evolve into an alternative to SWIFT, the US-controlled global payment network. That's more than innovation. That's monetary rebellion. The final layer is the one Washington fears most, the strategic layer. India has quietly signed defense training pacts with 14 African countries. It supplies coastal radar systems to Seychelles, Mauritius, and Mozambique, creating what analysts call the blue security arc. This network gives India, and by extension, its allies, early warning and strategic presence across the Indian Ocean. For the first time, America isn't the only power patrolling these waters. And that's what Washington truly didn't see coming. To the US establishment, Africa was supposed to be the next frontier for countering China. But while Washington drafted reports, India was making friends. While the US talked about democracy, India built data centers. While America gave out lectures, India offered loans without lectures. And today, Africa's young leaders, many of them under 45, openly say they prefer partnerships based on respect, not dominance. That shift is psychological. And no amount of American PR can reverse it. The truth is, Washington didn't underestimate Africa. It misread it. It thought Africa would choose charity over sovereignty. But Africa chose something different: agency. And India became the first major power to treat it as an equal player. That's not just a policy change. It's a generational rebellion. And now, as the US faces trade wars in Asia and a dollar under pressure from BRICS, the India-Africa 50 billion plan isn't just an economic alliance, it is a symbolic defiance. A message that the global south no longer needs permission to rise. Because what America didn't see coming is that the next world order won't be built in Washington or Beijing. It will be built in Nairobi, New Delhi, and Lagos. And it won't need anyone's approval. When the first reports about India's growing influence in Africa reached Washington think tanks, most analysts dismissed it. India doesn't have China's money, they said. It can't challenge America's soft power. But behind those confident statements was a quiet panic, because for the first time, US policymakers were watching Africa not through the lens of charity but competition. A leaked 2025 State Department memo titled India as Shadow in Africa warned that India's approach was subtly eroding US influence through partnership diplomacy. In plain English, America realized India wasn't competing with threats, it was competing with trust, and that Washington couldn't counter. At first, Western outlets tried to downplay the partnership, calling it symbolic, unsustainable, India's big experiment. But numbers don't lie. By 2025, India had outpaced the US as a preferred trade partner in at least 7 African economies, and a new generation of African entrepreneurs started looking east, not west, for investors in technology. Listen to the tone shift. Just 2 years ago, the US framed Africa as a developmental challenge. Now its reports call it a competitive frontier. That language matters because it reveals fear. In global politics, fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up in sanctions, sometimes in trade warnings, sometimes in sudden visits by American diplomats to African capitals they once ignored. Just weeks after India finalized its $50 billion infrastructure framework, Washington quietly revived old promises, pledging new U.S. investment in African technology and clean energy. But it was too late, because the narrative had already changed. At the 2025 African Union Summit, a symbolic moment happened. When the session opened, India was introduced not as a partner state, but as a strategic development ally, the same rank once reserved for the European Union and the United States. That single line sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Because in geopolitics, titles define power. Here's what makes this truly historic. For the first time, Africa is diversifying its alliances on its own terms, and India is benefiting from being the non-threatening giant. Unlike China, India carries no colonial baggage. Unlike the US, it doesn't project moral superiority. It's in between, the perfect balance between ambition and humility. And that's why African nations trust it. To the average American, this might sound distant, but to Washington's policymakers, it feels uncomfortably close, because this shift hits the 3 foundations of U.S. leverage in Africa: the dollar, the aid narrative, cultural influence, and all 3 are being quietly replaced. With rupee-based settlements and BRICS payment corridors emerging, the U.S. dollar's dominance in African trade is eroding not by rebellion but by replacement. When Kenya and India tested their rupee-shilling trade settlement pilot, economists in Washington called it a small experiment, but small experiments often trigger big consequences. Once trade bypasses SWIFT, the U.S. loses its economic visibility, and that's something Washington fears more than anything. For decades, the U.S. sold itself as Africa's moral compass, offering billions in humanitarian aid. But aid came with lectures, governance reforms, voting alignments, and conditional grants. India flipped the script. Instead of aid, it offered access to its universities, tech ecosystems, and pharmaceuticals. The result? African leaders started describing India as a partner in progress, not an owner. It's subtle, but in diplomacy, subtle changes build new power orders. This is the least discussed, but perhaps the most dangerous for U.S. soft power. India's film, tech, and education influence across Africa is rising faster than America's cultural exports. Bollywood movies dominate screens in Nigeria and Kenya. Indian universities host more African students than ever before. And cultural diplomacy, yoga centers, language schools, startup exchanges are reshaping Africa's younger generation's global outlook. They seek elaboration, not control. That's something America hasn't understood since the 1990s. But make no mistake, this isn't a fairy tale. India's rise in Africa isn't without risk. China watches closely, the US recalibrates quietly, and Europe, once Africa's gatekeeper, now feels increasingly irrelevant. Because the truth is, when 2 emerging powers cooperate, others always look for ways to divide them, and that's the new geopolitical game. In Washington's view, India and Africa's $50 billion alliance isn't just an economic move, it's a signal that global loyalty is no longer measured by proximity to the West, but by shared ambition. And ambition is something the West can't monopolize anymore. So where does this lead? A new Cold War? A 3-way standoff between Washington, New Delhi, and Beijing? Or a new chapter where the global South defines its own destiny? The answer depends on how far India and Africa are willing to go and how much America is willing to lose before it adapts. What America didn't see coming was that power doesn't always roar when it rises. Sometimes it moves quietly across oceans, through deals, through trust, and by the time Washington heard the sound, the $50 billion engine was already running.